mind frame where they'll be thinking, of course you have to do that, rather than why do asking themselves, why do we have to do that? You can almost smuggle in the ethics of racial justice in the U.S. with that approach. So I think that's smart.
Okay. Now, thank you so much. I need to figure out how to write that into it because to the policy. Okay, hold on. Let me see. Liz, can you just put that note in there that we want to use the funds to remove people out of those zones? Why is this not typing? I have to request access to it.
Blocked my X frame.
What's the matter with this? Are you on? What? You should have access.
So in the description, if you go to unitedandfierce.com, there's an events page.
Sure.
In the description, so if you click the RSVP button, there should be a show more for the specific event, and the Zoom link should be in that. But what I can do, actually,
try one more time.
Invite.
All right, I'm gonna
copy the invite link. Ray, I am going to send you an email.
Yeah, I got it. Okay. Perfect. You got the power.
Ray. Oh no, I don't know. I don't have your unicorn email. Hold on.
The environmental danger zones, what's it called? There's a real word.
Hold on. Talons. Check.
Environmental unsafe zone.
Check Discord. Talons. Check Discord.
Yeah, get the people in here. People.
Can I, if we have a brief pause here, can I say something real quick about like boosting the Twitch?
Please, yeah.
So real quick, anybody who's viewing on a computer and is in the meeting, if you can, if you don't already have the Twitch open in another tab, but the key is not to mute within their interface, but if you right-click the tab that you're watching this Twitch or Jared's Twitch and mute that site, you won't have to deal with, hearing the audio twice, but I believe that's the factor that still counts you as a viewer. And once these channels hit certain thresholds, so the first one is 3 average viewers across several days, the next one I think is 70.
Right, we're actually stuck, so we're at 1.4 on my channel. I've met all the other requirements, but yeah.
I'm right there with gaming, so if everybody does that, it should boost the viewership. Those are like counted as active viewers in spite of lurks, but I think Twitch understands lurks is a lot of their views, so they will as long as the site is muted but not the player. The video player, I don't think it has to be the active window or active tab to be counted, but I think the player has to be unmuted, like the audio has to be unmuted in the player, so make sure you are muting only the site or at source. So like if you have it playing on your phone on the side, I think your phone's volume can be turned down, as long as, again, the player, that audio is not muted, and it'll add to the numbers. And these, like Jasmine was just mentioning, when you do that, if you like Jasmine was saying, the page is stuck at under 3 average viewers. Once you pass that threshold, the point is it puts that content in front of more people, and then I think you'll see, like, so for every 3, when you hit that threshold of average 3 lurkers, because we're all trying to support, it'll get in front of people. You'll start to have more organic viewers who are watching out loud and following along and asking questions. So just wanted to throw that out there. Over.
That's a great suggestion. I wonder if I can do it for myself. Would I count as a viewer?
I believe you can. I think it counts it on IP addresses, so I think technically you can even do it. I might have just used IP addresses incorrectly, but I think you can do it per device as well.
Ooh, don't tell me that.
Yeah, and so
I'll be my own 3 before you know it.
Right. I'm on both right now. You can have both. Since they don't count only which window is active, I believe you can have more than one channel per device as long as you have
Keep counting.
multi-tab viewing available.
It's
So,
fine.
for example, right now in my browser, I'm watching both Jared's and Jasmine's streams.
We're gonna
I think
we're gonna
I'm being
try
counted
because
for
it's
both. I'm not
it's worth
100%
saving.
sure. I'd have to be more Google.
A little bit of
But yeah, so and I could share my screen if I didn't know how to do that, but it's pretty simple. It's open a new tab in your browser, go to where you want to go, make sure it's unmuted. So it might get noisy for a second, but then as soon as you've got all that playing as if you're watching the whole thing in full, then right click the tab that Twitch is opening, and there should be an option in almost any browser that says something like mute site, mute source, or mute audio.
Yep, you're right.
Good to know.
I'm learning something new every day.
I'm trying.
sure.
I'm trying to learn.
We just got my buddy not long ago. He relaunched his gaming page, and I think in a week we got him past the 3 mark just from lurks. But then, of course, he's also a very handsome person and good at video games, so the organic one's very quick to follow. So I'm sure the same growth will happen with this time.
Yeah, we like surprisingly we already have 100 followers. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah, so I mean, I can't speak for others, but myself, I work from home, and it's a sensitive field. I can never be known to be using media at the same time. So I absolutely won't say anything or play it out loud, but I can almost always lurk. So whenever I catch Jasmine's in the morning, and now that I'm subscribed to Jared, when I get those emails, I'll try to make sure I open them in new tabs and at least lurk. Even if I can't interact too much. So I don't know. The point being, I don't know if other folks can do that or not. I know it's not feasible for everybody, but especially those folks who have the downtime, where even if you can't be actively participating for the whole thing, if you have especially like a laptop or a desktop computer or a tablet where you could do multiple tab viewing, even if you got to mute the site and not participate much, it can help boost the stats.
We're already up to 6. That's cool.
Hey.
All right. Welcome, Rachel. Okay, so for everyone that just joined in our Twitch following, I want to explain what's happening. So this is our environmental justice meeting, and one of the big focuses has been triple bottom line accounting. And Jared, I know Gerald, you're gonna get tired. Not Jared. I meant Gerald, not Jared. I just want to say the beards are intense, and they're both on the same line. I love them. Please don't cut the beard. Back the beard, everybody. But if you could go over for everyone what triple bottom line accounting is, real quick, and then explain why we want to use that money to relocate people now that we've come up with that plan, I think that's a cool segue to explain to people how we start taking back control of our environment.
For sure. So real quick, triple bottom line accounting or triple bottom line economics, if you want to Google it, those are the phrases you'll probably use. It's not a new approach in the sense of recency, but new in terms of it's not what we're currently doing. So in our economy, the way companies' performance is measured, especially publicly traded companies, is you subtract from all the money they make selling whatever they sell this year. You subtract from that the cost that it took them, the financial cost that it took them to produce and deliver those things. So, for example, Amazon makes a lot of stuff out of plastic. So they've got a plastic stuff budget and they've got a budget to run their factories. The problem is they don't currently account for things like damage to the environment. They don't directly account. They don't directly account for things like workers who are injured or die in the workplace. And some folks might point to lawsuits, but the quick and obvious flaw there is that's after someone's already hurt or died, and only if they win their lawsuit. So triple bottom line is an approach to include these costs from the start, to accept the reality that if you run a large-scale business, or
You're
really
going to hear
any
me
scale,
eat.
but
Sorry,
if
I've
you
been in
run
a
a
meeting since 9
large-scale
o'clock.
business, you're going to have costs that are not currently accounted for and not easily accounted for in just dollars. There's an easy light budget because the energy company sends the company a bill. There's not such an easy fingers caught in machines budget because what is that really worth? What's your hand worth to you? It's something that's not accounted for. So triple bottom line says instead of this single bottom line of revenue minus cost equals profit, where we currently are, we add two more bottom lines. One is human cost, and one is environmental cost. I'll pause there in case anybody in the group thinks something needs clarified.
No, you go.
All right, counted to 5 in my head, no sound, so we're good. So what Jasmine's mentioning is this second bottom line being the human cost. Doesn't matter which order they go in, to be honest, but I think typically the second bottom line is thought of as human cost and the third being environmental. The second bottom line here being human cost. When we talk about things like, especially for example, I think eminent domain is the one that comes to everyone's mind. Situations where land is being used for highways or for factories or power plants where people are not given much choice. I guess eminent domain is the extreme example of that variable, right? They're given no choice whatsoever. Your land is needed, you're moving. But even with companies buying up land where there's technically a choice, but they've been rezoned or their land has been bought, etc. In cases like that, Jasmine's point, I think, is we need to account for that. Even if we change nothing about what's allowed and what's not allowed to be bought, sold, taken by eminent domain, even changing nothing about that, if we at least, with the existing practices, start to account for real replacement costs, not just we paid you for what the assessor says your property and land are worth, as happens from what I understand in eminent domain. On top of that, we need to be adding things like, are we moving someone from a neighborhood where they have readily available fresh food to a food desert because that's the only other place in their town with a comparable rent? So I think Jasmine's point is we need to start accounting for things like that. We need to start accounting for things like health risks. When people who we aren't moving, when we say you don't have to move, but now your zone is different and there's going to be a power plant nearby dumping some agency decided was an acceptable amount of waste in the water. Even if you don't directly get your drinking water from there, that's your environment. What is the cost of that? And I see some hands up. Over.
Jared, you can go first.
Yeah, so that's incredibly timely based on something that happened in February in our state. Something not a lot of people are aware of because it doesn't get publicized. We literally, interesting phone ring. Sorry, our state has on multiple occasions accepted literal train cars full of human waste from out of state to dump into our landfills. Like from as far away as New York, New Jersey. They literally ship shit to our state and dump it in a landfill.
Wow. And if you don't mind me asking a quick question
Yeah.
about that, do you know, like, where is that landfill? Was that a new landfill, or is that just they're adding now a new source of waste to
Yep.
that? Okay, so new
Existing
source.
landfill. Yep.
Mm.
It is near Birmingham. The actual city, I don't remember offhand, but it is near. It's like Adamsville, I think, is the name of the city. It's a small, because it's so small, it doesn't make the news, but it's a small town northwest of Birmingham, essentially. And it's happened twice in recent history. Coincidentally, both during election years, so 2018 and 2022. It's interesting that it happened during election years, but they got in trouble in 2018 and were told not to do it again. And they're like, okay, my bad. We won't do that again. And then they did it again this year. So
yeah, I see that February 10th, 22 headline says New York poop train may be back in Alabama.
Yeah.
I googled it, and I got this article. One of Alabama's poorest Black communities has become once again a major dumping ground for trash from up and down the eastern seaboard. The small city of Uniontown in Alabama's Black Belt is awash in a deluge of out-of-state garbage, receiving more than 500,000 tons of waste through the first 3 quarters of 2021, according to records from the Alabama Department of Environmental Management.
Yee.
Yeah. So, and just a slight follow up and then let you keep going. But in order to try and hide it, they ended up moving it from the train cars into like dump trucks. Well, a little bit different because the dump truck doesn't actually seal, but trucks. And from what the locals said, because I couldn't find a whole lot reporting on it, but some of the locals were saying that they were not sealed vehicles. So as they're going through the mountainous areas and hitting bumps and everything else, it's just sloshing waste as they're making their way to the landfill. So it's huge. Over.
Yeah. Jasmine, you had your hand up next too.
This article, real quick. Yeah, sorry, Jasmine, go ahead.
No, I just had a question about when it comes to those zones. Should we start reaching out to those people now and asking them if they'd want to be considered? Should we want, like, you know what I'm trying to say? Like, we need to start working on a campaign where they can start protesting, or we need to get them engaged to know that their zones are toxic and that we want them to be able to move. So I hate to say it, but how do we feel about that labor? Like picking, like Jared's in Alabama, we definitely could reach out to his constituents first.
Right.
It makes more sense to start asking them about their zones. Would they be interested in moving? That came up, but I also was thinking about in situations where you have an adult that says, "This is my home. My parents built this house in 102. I don't want to leave. I want to die here." It's a toxic place, and they have children in that home. What do we do when the parent wants to stay in a place that's toxic, but it impacts the child? Because until now, remember, we're giving children rights.
Yeah, can I speak to that for a second?
If you need to, because I didn't.
Good. Okay. I don't know if anybody else had thoughts, but you just gave me what feels like a good idea. I'm not super versed on it, but I know that in current like eminent domain law and cases, there is some method of evaluating the land it's more complex than just the price per square yard, for example, on average in that area. I don't think it's that simplistic, thankfully. I think that's a good thing, right? I think they do some work. Like if you're to back up eminent domain, I'm sure everybody knows, just to put it out loud, eminent domain is when the government can take your property for the use of some public thing like a highway, I guess is the most common example. As I currently understand it, they don't just tell you, oh, well, your neighborhood sells for this much on average, so here's your average cost of your lot size. They don't read it that simple, right? They account for things like you've got a house on that lot, and that's not free. So I think they do some accounting for things like that. They have assessors who come out and do their best to get a real accounting for the value of the property being taken from you. And to Jasmine's earlier point, this might go to answer exactly that question, like how to get people energized about it. If someone has the time, what I'd love to know is how are they accounting for that value beyond just square footage of land, square footage of house? Because there have been, I'm sure, multiple cases that I'm not read enough on, but I'm sure multiple cases where they account for things like, actually I had a law professor in undergrad who tells a hilarious story about he had a client that had a pond and they wanted to pay this person only for the land and the property, but the person's a farmer. So if you move a farmer with animals with access to a pond to a plot of land that does not have a free water source, and now they have to pay for water, that is not the same thing. So, he won that case to get him to reconsider, okay, y'all at least need to consider the fact that this is a material, this is a material value. Material in this case, like the legal jargon, meaning very important to the outcome of the decision, very important to the evaluation. If I sell you my car, but I take off all the tires first, you're going to be a little upset that you paid for the whole car. That's the thinking. I think there's already legal precedent for this, right? There's already ways to measure for, okay, we can't just pay you for the grass and the walls. We got to pay you for the roof and the water and the whatever, right? However, we can kind of reverse engineer that or inject this second bottom line in there, I think is the lowest resistance path. But there's like a little bit of a kind of convenient process here that whatever it takes to find out what that math is probably can be turned into pretty data to piss people off on their own behalf. right? Because if we could say, here's a way the government currently accounts for things like farmers with ponds, why aren't they accounting for your insert any value or risk, right? Why aren't they accounting for the fact that they're putting lead in your dirt? Why aren't they accounting for the fact that you currently are a walk from a grocery store, and in your city, all the other neighborhoods at your median rent is a 20-minute car ride from a grocery store with fresh food, for example. So I just thought I'd bring that up because I'm not sure what the end answer is in the shortest way, but I think the point is the same work that it takes to research how do you calculate for things like this, the second bottom line, all along the way, each little small win, each little new pool of data found, I think it is probably pretty smart to turn into some digestible graphic, even for for all of us, myself included, who aren't scholars in this, right? To say you don't need to know um, material or immaterial facts. You don't need to know all the eminent domain law. What you need to know is you have good drinking water, and the town over, everybody has to boil every other month because of whatever catastrophe. So that should cost more money. And again, to put it out there, because a lot of folks have heard this, but for anybody who hasn't, when we talk about triple bottom line approaches, it's often going to sound cold, clinical, or cruel. The point is not that we don't care about things beyond how much money does it cost you to move to a different house. The point is recognizing that the agencies with power now, whether they be governmental agencies or publicly traded corporations, don't care. And even if some people in them do care, it is not within their job description, and therefore they don't have the authority to act upon that concern. You might have very considerate, kind-hearted people who find themselves working in large organizations, and it's simply there is not a budget for go interview the family you're relocating to ask them their qualitative experience of, like Jasmine's example, why do you want to live in this 102-year-old house with lead pipes and nightmares in the soil? We're not going to talk down to people who do, because there is real tangible value that is not always neatly quantified, even if we can take a pass. So just wanted to clarify so we don't get off track. When you hear triple bottom line concerns, try not to think of how cold it is that we're putting things like someone's fondness for their neighborhood into dollars. I understand it could seem that way, but the task here isn't to perfectly capture someone else's value of their life. The task here is to leverage the real and demonstrable facts about those shared experiences, because we're all human, to change the behaviors of organizations that previously wielded only capital for only the purpose of obtaining more capital. So the goal here is, how do you get those public, especially my focus, publicly traded companies, to make a different decision? That's it. That's all that matters. If you can't get them to do that, no amount of graphics, publicity, and meetings will help the people that are most impacted. So just want to put that in there. Over. Are there any questions at the moment, or any other topics that come to mind for folks, in including this second bottom line for things like rezoning, relocation, and eminent domain?
So I love we plan to use eminent domain a lot, but I want to make sure I understand. Are we saying that for parents that will not relocate on hazardous land, we execute eminent domain to protect their children? Because that's my thing. That's the thing I'm thinking about right now. For people under 16, they need their rights protected. And we have all met that parent. Like, there's some parents who practice a religion where their child will not be given a blood transfusion. Nobody asks the kid if they want to live because mommy and daddy believe in sky fairies or whatever. So little Timmy dies. Which, I mean, like, if you want to go hard for religion, I support the religion that people like. They really test that faith. I'm all about that. Snake charmers too. I mess with them because they believe, right? But how do we protect children that are under 16 and cannot relocate when their parents, like, do we, I hate to say it, like, this goes into a social services issue. Do we say, little Johnny's got rights, you are infringing upon them while you want to stay in this toxic junk?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think and if it got confused, I was pointing to eminent domain as a good precedent for how to count for adequate and impactful compensation. But I think probably we don't exercise. I think probably we decrease the number of times eminent domain is used as much as possible, right? Because it always avoids what I think is the more important preceding question of, instead of why is this person being moved and what's a fair amount to get them to move, why are we making the thing that requires the move? Do we need a 6-lane highway? Why are that many people having to travel an hour for work? Like, why aren't the people working in that city living in that city? What's going on with the rent that's happening? And obviously you can't tackle all that. So more to the point of your question, I think you use eminent domain as a precedent. I think that you're right that it becomes a social service issue, but maybe some accounting here can be considered in the risk of things like, if a parent really doesn't want to move because they're tied to that house, but it's, the water's not drinkable, the power goes out, the kid can't do school, it's not safe to get to school, the soil's poisoned. In a case like that, I guess maybe you look at an accounting for what would it cost them to be moved. And if there's nothing else in their city, I think for all of us it's not fair to basically tell someone, you're failing your child, even if for a bad reason, right? They've got some superstitious or explicitly emotional reason to want to stay in a place that's demonstrably bad for their child's health and their health. Even if they got a bad reason to do that, if they don't have an alternative, then obviously that's a different outcome than, like, places where there's plenty of cheaper places around and they're just stuck to that plot because it's the family land. On the other hand, I think that's not to be ignored, right? If they're stuck to that plot because it's the family land, I don't think we do a good enough job of asking.
I want to point out, we do land back, so they're losing all that land anyway because their ancestors didn't care when they came over and killed the people that were on that land originally. So I will tell people right now, America, hear me. I have no sympathy for anybody who's been living somewhere for 105 years, because you got that 105 years there through the murder and genocide of indigenous peoples. And yes, it wasn't you, but there was blood on your hands, but you are benefiting from it. Now we're going to pay you as we can, but this eminent domain thing is not negotiable. We have to fix this country, and we have to write those original sins. So enjoy your memories. Take a long walk around your property now. Record it. Put it on your smartphone. But if you are in a place, I am not going to be taking your emotional considerations into effect because your ancestors did not do that either.
Right. And I just want to say that I see Liz's question. I want to talk about that in a second too. But real quick, Jasmine, at that point, I was thinking actually of, like, Black families comes to mind. Black families who, some ancestor was one of the first to be able to buy their own land. And the point still stands. That land was able to be bought for the same exact reason, right? It was violently allotted. But, when you get into that history of Black folks who have ancestors who didn't choose to come over and then get out of that system some generations later and have to find somewhere to live, and that just happens to be the way it works in the system they find themselves. I think, unfortunately, there are still lots of living descendants of people in exactly that scenario where that's how they got their land, their house, whatever, and that's why they're emotionally tied to it. So, like, generally, of course, I think you already know that I'm with you ideologically of the emotional reason shouldn't trump what's best for yourself, your health. Those emotions are a valuable part of your human experience. If you don't have emotions, and there's got to be a link. So if you don't have emotions, good experiences to remember, then what was the point of living at all? Surely not just to drink water and earn checks. But this kind of ties into Liz's question. Do you think people will take the scientific proof of the detriment to their health and be more willing to get up and go? I think in a lot of cases not. because they weren't under the impression that their land was some particularly healthy or health beneficial place in the first place. That's not why they're tied to it. So that's not why they're going to get disassociated from it easily. But I think that when you show not just what the detriment is, right, but that was kind of my point about using eminent domain as a precedent. When you show not just what the health detriment is, but if we start convincing through triple bottom line government agencies, large corporations to say, okay, we know we have to pay not just for the square footage. Okay, we know we have to pay not just for the number of bedrooms in the house that we're stealing. We have to pay for some of the value, the true and intrinsic value to that person and how it affects their life. If you get them to do that, I think you can start getting them to do something like what we're talking about, compensate for the actual cost of moving a family. And when you get that accounting done, while just saying this water is bad for you isn't going to get the emotionally tied to the land people to move, what you do get is a body of data that shows them other things like, okay, you might not care or you might not believe or you might not really stop and think about the fact that the water that's coming to your house is bad for you and bad for your children. But when we tell you that we've measured it to be this bad or it costs this much to get you somewhere where that is not a problem, and you start showing people like your life in a different, unfortunately, plot of land, unfortunately to you anyway, in a different plot of land can look like this. You can have, it's not going to be the house your great great granddad built, but it's going to be a house where you can continue to have those family dinners and continue to have your kids live with you or whatever's important to them about that land. It's not all about quantitative data, even though we have to end at a number. If we can take these approaches that a lot of researchers around the world have gotten really good at about collecting qualitative data, why is the land important to this family? If it's literally just, I've only ever lived here, maybe that's, maybe we draw a line somewhere that's not something we accounted for. But I grew up here, I have memories of my dad, my dad's gone now, etc., whatever. You get from stories to that, like, this is where I raised my kids. But what about raising your kids was different here than anywhere else? That your kids got to play in nature. Okay, that's something you can somewhat quantify, right? What's the price in the same municipality, if it's available, of some place with comparable access to nature? Because that's a real part of kids' education. That's a real part of.
So the other thing about that is we are going to be paying people the price for eminent domain that they currently pay marginalized people to move now. So they do not consider any of that shit when they move brown bodies.
Right.
So we will not be white centering and considering that. I love the suggestion, but I just want to explain. So in a different meeting, we go through with the legal department, and the legal department has told me legally I got to pay the bare minimum. And the bare minimum is what they determine for brown people all the time. So Bill Gates, anybody that owns all that land is going to get the bare minimum. Like I said, that's why I'm clear about the emotional attachment and investment is irrelevant to me because that wasn't passed on to other people equally as well. We have to go for equality.
I'm with you on equality, but one way to achieve that equality rather than drive the average down is to pull the minimum up, I'd say. To your point, this hasn't been paid historically to black and brown families, people, and individuals.
So the great people like to pay white people what they pay brown people. So that's what I'm saying. It's not in this situation when I talk to people about race in America, right? And white people say racism is over. Okay, cool. Do you want us to treat you how we treat brown people? No, I don't want that shit. So in this instance, it is faster. There is more precedent for me to pay them less than to pay everyone else more. This is that capitalist side people love. So there you go. I'm still a banker. Over. Story, your turn.
Just want to say that, like, even if it doesn't feel like a white-centric issue, since I think it's like 63% of homeowners who live in their homes are white people, it is a white-centered thing. It's mostly going to be white people getting these payments because brown people don't own the buildings that need the eminent domain situation. You know what I mean? Like, they do, but at a much smaller percentage statistically. So, you can talk about it being equality because we're giving the other homeowners a lot more too. But the thing is, land owning has always, in the history of this country, has always been a white-centered thing and is still today. Over.
Yeah, definitely. And I'd take both of those points, and I agree. But remember, the point was not to we weren't only using eminent domain to affect these changes. Eminent domain was just my reference for the fact that some version of accounting is already being done, so maybe we can inject triple bottom line into it and use that as an example of how to value things. Like one of the examples we talked about is not only literally removing people through eminent domain. One thing that came up actually at the beginning, the prompt for this was rezoning. When people are remaining where they are, but now harmful things are being brought to their neighborhood. My point was, why don't we look at it the way that historically we've looked at valuing when people are being removed from their residence? We can treat it similarly in the other way, and if we inject triple bottom line, I think we get a better outcome where when people are having something like a factory brought to their neighborhood, your company or your municipality doesn't get to do that for free. You don't get to pollute and pretend you're not polluting anymore. You're going to pay dollars to make it right. So just to be clear, I totally agree. I'm not suggesting we, use eminent domain more, expand it, and then try to somehow make it more equitable. I'm saying, why don't we look at eminent domain as one way to start?
For the zoning.
Yeah, justify greater value when we're rezoning and compensating and making whole these families that don't have a choice about what's in their neighborhood.
That's fair. Okay, Liz, can you take that note? So we will use triple bottom line accounting for the cases of eminent domain where it was an environmental forced rezoning, not eminent domain. Gotcha, bitch. That's that's plan one. This is plan AB. Okay, Story, your turn.
I was just also going to agree that makes sense, not for eminent domain, but for when we're doing like this company polluted this land, now you got to pay these people to relocate. Just totally going behind it for triple bottom line situations.
Right. My bad. I didn't wait for over. I apologize.
I said over.
I know. I started speaking first, and it was rude. I apologize. So, you're absolutely right, and that was the point. Was eminent domain is a good example. I don't know if you're here for this part, sorry, but eminent domain is a good example of how we don't only pay people. So, like right now in rezoning, to Jasmine's earlier point, the people who suffer these kind of injustices of nonsense being brought to their neighborhood that's demonstrably bad for them and killing them, frankly. It's often, justified by there were meetings, you had a choice, yada yada. Beyond just that, they don't get to go to those meetings because people have to work. Not everybody's going to understand the language. Not everybody's going to understand the time. Not everybody has a ride. Beyond that, I think it's often talked about like, if everyone says yes, this will just happen and we'll stop thinking about it. As long as that company pays their taxes, we're good. The point is, that's not even how it works in eminent domain, which, again, not saying we're going to start using it for this. I'm pointing to it as an already bad example that's still better than what's happening to these people, right? Even in the, gross cases of eminent domain where, yes, it mostly affects white people, so let's set that down to the minimum. But even in those cases that could affect other people too, they're often treated, better than just were you at the meeting. They're at least given what's your land worth, what's your house worth, what does it actually cost to get a comparable house in your area, where that same consideration is not, as far as I know, not being given to cases where rezoning brings something new and hazardous to your neighborhood. So I don't remember when you popped in or not, Story, but just so we're all on the same page, the idea here is, okay, if we can't reverse it all, if we can't stop it all now, if we still have to have power plants in neighborhoods and poop trains that go somewhere, then are we at least saying the bare minimum for bringing poop trains to Alabama is now going to be, you don't just get to pay for what is that landfill, whether publicly or privately owned, charge you to store that cubic volume of waste. That's not it anymore. Now it's, we can demonstrate for a fact the water in this area is now polluted. The plants in this area changing in whatever way, or some local produce becomes literally inedible for whatever, these are just examples. I'm sure I'm wrong on most of them, but if we can find any outcomes that we know are reliably linked to some new decision, especially as it relates to zoning or eminent domain, but focusing on zoning, are we not at least accounting for like a version of what eminent domain does? And then when asking that question, let's take it a step further and inject a triple bottom line in there. So those are my thoughts, but obviously, you all have. I learned something every call, so open for questions, comments, feedback, or corrections. Over.
So I've got a question since I didn't put my hand up, but nobody was talking. So sorry. In the poop train scenario, like, would that cost be on the company accepting the poop or the people bringing it into town? Where is that? Where do we think that cost gets applied?
That's a great question. So in triple bottom line accounting, we would try to let companies keep putting things in the same places on their financial performances. What that means is, to answer your question, let's say it's a privately owned landfill that accepts the privately owned poop train. So the privately owned poop train, I don't know this to be the case. I'm just saying for our example.
It's yes.
Oh no, I was honestly kind of hoping I was wrong on at least one of those, but I hate. Okay, fine. What nightmare have we found ourselves in? So the privately owned poop train already accounts for the cost to get that train down to Alabama, unload, and turn around and drive back. They already account most likely for some fee that the privately owned landfill charges them to accept that waste. Yeah, to drop their load. So, the thought here is if you're counting taking that waste somewhere as a cost, we're not saying make up stuff. We're saying, okay, does driving the poop train down the road, down the railroad, does it spill along the way? Are you messing up, neighborhoods where the poop train goes through as well? And then once you get there, you've unloaded that poop. So it's up to then the receiving company. So they're only charging for what they feel is a reasonable fee to accept the waste, and then that transaction's done. So probably for the company who owns the poop, they stop there, but it has an interesting impact. The landfill accepting the waste, now in a similar manner, they already account for how much it costs to store waste on that land, which I'm assuming is minimal because they just remain owning the land. So what we're saying is now you have to account for the effect of the waste you put into that land. So what happens is we don't tell the train company, oh, you have to count for some cost of waste that you have essentially disposed of. But what will happen is the landfill company will say, well, now if we have to account for the damage this does to the local environment, and our shareholders are seeing that, and our stock is not looking great, we have to get that cost from somewhere. So necessarily the fee to do so goes up. And one common criticism here, and I see Story saying, I'm going to close out this thought and let Story speak. One common thought is, well, that's just going to drive the cost of everything up, right? The whole inflation fallacy of like, oh, if wages go up, the price of everything goes up. But again, here, there's another overlooked feature of this that no, because these companies won't accept infinite loss, they won't accept infinite cost. At some point, the landfill will say you can't bring your poop here, and then the poop train company will run out of places to put trains full of poop into, so they will necessarily, by definition, need to do something else with the poop than throw it on a train and dump it in somebody's poor neighborhood. They're going to have to start thinking about, well, shoot, now that it costs all this extra money, maybe composting gets cheaper than putting it on a train to Alabama, which probably currently is not the case. I can almost guarantee you, if they could turn it into something they could sell for cheaper than they could train it, that train would have never got there, right? It's all about who can make the most money. Over, Story.
So, loving this, a problem we're going to run into is like the Philip Morris situation, where they're like, you can't prove tobacco causes cancer for 30 years. a matter of proving the impact is going to come up because that same lobbyist from Philip Morris that did all that again worked for GE, saying the exact same lines about you can't prove PCBs cause cancer. And the thing with PCBs is they don't automatically cause cancer. They're an endocrine disruptor. They cause ovarian cysts. They cause hormonal disruption, and they can cause problems that can eventually lead to cancer. But he spent all his time saying they don't cause cancer, and they couldn't prove a direct A plus B equals C like cancer because it's like a 5-step process with endocrine disruptors. And you know what I mean? It's just like sort of getting ahead of that through monitoring. Like we need to be able to measure all of our data has to be measurable impact because otherwise it's gonna get caught up in this like litigation lobbyist prove it thing that has happened historically with a lot of other similar problems. Okay.
And thank you for bringing that point up. I'm going to put a couple reminders to myself in the chat. So they are answers, but I'm going to use them as talking points for the long form. Two approaches to that. One, remember that one of the uses of the triple bottom line accounting approach is one thing we talked about before, a definition. Shareholders, investors are academically considered to be reasonable, but no one in practice believes that. No one at all believes that the stock market runs on well-reasoned decisions about the values of companies. Now, that's turned it into the rich people's casino. So we can hijack that through guerrilla auditing. So you and I both know that there was likely reliable enough data before any of these court cases were starting to be won against tobacco companies. Well before that, there was reliable enough data that people who are interested, and even the common person who generally considers themselves as believing of mainstream science, would have been convinced. They would have been convinced that the problems being raised were true and worth focusing on. The problem that you're pointing out, you're absolutely right. These lobbyists will prevent lawsuits. But again, triple bottom line, we're going around the lawsuit. We're not waiting till it happens and then asking for some bits of a payout that gets whittled down to nothing by the time it gets to these families. What we're doing is, we absolutely want it codified eventually. But I think in the short term, if we can do this auditing ourselves, not just us, of course, but researchers who are interested in these topics, they're already producing the data. So the first thing I was suggesting was, rather than only having these two very separate reports, right? The publicly accepted SEC required financial reports of these publicly traded companies that say nothing about these topics. And then on the other hand, you have these very verbose, dense with jargon academic journals about the impacts of poop trains on Alabama communities. Rather than only having these two extremes that have they're perceived as having nothing to do with each other, what we need is to take the triple bottom line method to marry these. Okay, this is Amazon's claimed performance. Amazon has 4 warehouses that use Alabama poop trains to get rid of their waste. So this is the known environmental cost as studied by these nerds, used friendly, but researchers, academics, who they've shown what the impact of every metric ton of poop dumped in Alabama is on local waterways, fish, people, and whatever. Put that into a triple bottom line, and what you get is you have this report that you can show as almost identical to the published Amazon report. Here's our triple bottom line Amazon report. I have a hypothesis, and I'm willing to be proven wrong or told why that's not a great place to focus, that if you get that report out there in a digestible format, in the same place where people are looking for financial news, they're going to see it, whether reasonably or not, as an indicator of future change. And that will change the stock market in weird ways. What you'll likely get is people who, especially, in investing, one of the big things people consider is, yeah, poop doesn't cause cancer. The lobbyists, yeah, they'll say it, but that's the point. Is that's going to hurt lawsuits. It's not going to hurt the drive to move stock prices. So in investing, one of the big things people consider is, what is each investor's objective? Jeff Bezos is far less risk averse than me. I do not have the pocket money to buy a small company and just see how it goes. So your average investor is going to have some more risk tolerance than like poor people. than the 98%. But people who have any money to spend on stock at all are not always blind to risk, right? They're thinking about the long term, but they want any edge they can get to know which companies are going down, which companies are going up as soon as possible. Even though they should focus on the long term, it's known performance affects shares. That's known. So if you can get data that shows people, puts the task on them to decide, is this reliable, is this meaningful, but shows it in the same format, I am of the opinion currently very few investors would ignore that data. They could. Some of them might brush it off as leftist propaganda. Fine. But almost no one will ignore it. They'll all click it. So that's one thing is, the guerrilla auditing. I totally agree with you on the likely outcome of this politically in the short term, but we don't wait for lobbyists to be defeated by ethical politicians. We don't wait for lawsuits to be won. We say, this is the fact of this company's real world performance in a sane world where we actually care how much it costs to undo some of this damage. What are you going to do about it? And most investors are going to say, look, I'm still going to invest in the giant ones, GE, Amazon, whoever, but among, let's say, top 5, right? Among the Amazon, the Walmart, the Apple, whatever, which of those 5 has the lowest nightmares in the double and triple bottom lines? Which ones are doing the least catastrophes? People are not going to ignore that data. So I think that's one place where you get a win in spite of these very real challenges that you bring up. The second point, which does unfortunately rely more on some political successes, is expanding and utilizing more than ever judiciary dissolution, which for anyone who has not heard that phrase before, this is the concept of essentially forcing a company to close because of some wrongdoing. It's currently, I think if I remember from our research, it's only ever been used twice in U.S. history.
Huh?
So if we all just take 3
Oh,
seconds to think of catastrophes we've heard of where maybe perhaps that company shouldn't operate anymore, I think we'll quickly get to more than 2.
I don't have a preference.
So, the idea here is,
On what?
okay, we need to stop these companies who are, knowably doing the wrong thing, resulting in people's deaths
I don't care.
from operating ever again. They don't get to be
I don't even
companies.
really know what we have. So.
Now, almost no one's going to be on board with that from the start, except for those who are probably already in this room. However,
I don't know what
triple bottom line,
I don't know what we have.
As if codified, if we got to that
I don't
political
need it till
success, triple bottom line is kind of a report card to let companies defend themselves.
Oh,
If we show, based on, to Story's point, based on reliable data, we're only including those things that can be, well demonstrated. Even if we stick with that very stringent version, right? We're not saying maybe the poop trains are hurting the fish 2 towns over. We're saying, look at this pond next to the poop train landfill. All the fish died this year. We collected some of those fish. We found that they died of Alabama poop train poisoning disease. Then that's something we account for, and then we publish the the financial report as including that number, that second bottom line of that landfill company, and we say this is the performance of this company. 1, the public image, they can't get that back, but 2, they have some time to refute that, to appeal, to say, no, actually, sorry, we counted the cost. It's correct, these fish died. However, here's a quick way to restore that. It's not going to cost as much as you think. Then they, take it to jury, whatever, account for the real cost. But then if your company fails an appeal and doesn't pay for the restorative cost, congratulations. You get to be the 3rd company in U.S. history to suffer judiciary dissolution. Your company is sold. I don't know from there. Is that an eminent domain? Does the country now own the corpse of that company, or I would say that gets divided amongst its victims? And I'm gonna stop there.
So I would love to answer that question for you, but I don't know. But I do know that it's 1:01, so we are over an hour. This has been a great conversation, though. I think we should come back to it. But we have another meeting to jump to.
Thank you.
Just don't look at me like that.
Sorry to go long.
It wasn't you. I was reading Zachary's comment in the chat.
Yeah, they're yeah. Don't look up Jankum. That's all I'll say on that. Don't Google it.
Okay. All right, thanks,
Thanks,
y'all.
everybody.
I'm jumping.
All right.
I'm jumping.
Bye.
Hey.
Record.